Hi, everyone. Today is October 23rd, 2024, and we have a special guest on the show, Yolian Ogbu. Yolian is the coordinator of the U.S. Out of Africa Network and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Africa team based in New York. Her academic research examines inter-imperialist rivalry and the conditions for internationalist working class struggle amidst the green transition from Eastern to Central Africa. As the daughter of Eritrean freedom fighters, she is committed to publicizing the history of worker fightback and connecting the struggle for liberation across the African continent. Yolian, thank you for coming on the show and welcome to the Activist News Network.
Hi, Janae. Thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So let's just get right into it. So the month of action against AFRICOM is a significant initiative in challenging U.S. military intervention in Africa. Can you explain the main goals of this effort and why it's critical to highlight Afrikaans' presence in African nations?
Absolutely. I guess before I can answer kind of the main goals, understanding what Africom is would really kind of help contextualize why we're even, why we have a campaign around this. So, Africom, which stands for the United States Africa Command, is one of 11 of the U.S. Department of Defense combatant commands with a specific function within the African continent, and they're responsible for all types of like military operations, security operations, intelligence operations on the African continent. And it initially began in 2007. Then it really kind of started in 2008. And since then, it's only grown. But as of recently, there's been this struggle to, expel AFRICOM in certain parts of the continent, which is exciting. The campaign that the Black Alliance for Peace has, which this is our fourth year, I believe, of the month of action against AFRICOM, is to apply pressure and spread awareness as part of a larger political education campaign and understanding the role of U.S. militarism in Africa specifically. I think what a lot of folks in BAP noticed early on was kind of the understanding imperialism, understanding kind of anti-war movement in the US seemed to have largely kind of left out the African and African diaspora and Black communities. So I think this is really the reason why we've kind of pushed forward this campaign and kept it going for the fourth year in a row. And I'm really excited to have been, working with folks on it. And we have various kind of themes every year. This past or it's the end of the month, but we had a webinar that was talking about kind of resisting fascism and what does the renewed struggle for Pan-Africanism look like on the continent. So we were able to have a lot of really interesting different voices that are connected to our campaign speak out about their work.
Definitely. Yeah, that sounds a critically important work. So thank you for that. One of the key messages of the campaign is the connection between U.S. foreign policy in Africa and domestic militarization, especially in Black communities here in the U.S. And so, how do you see the parallels between AFRICOM and U.S. policing practices, such as those seen in programs like Cop City or the 1033 program? Um, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it kind of speaks to the first point that I alluded to around why even have a campaign around AFRICOM because of the kind of gaps in the anti-war movement that were noticed at the time, right? There was no kind of under context for why we saw more war, more conflict, more quote unquote terrorism on the continent. So putting together a campaign like the Month of Action Against AFRICOM was to connect those struggles. So particularly why we talk about the connection between U.S. foreign policy and domestic militarization is that the conditions are essentially in the framing of like why they need to, militarize certain areas and specifically certain communities actually are the same and speaks to why our struggle as Black people, as African diaspora here and abroad are largely the same and connected. It's interesting because the US policing practices, things like Cop City and the 1033 program, largely speak to kind of the funding that we're noticing in repressing and making sure that Black communities in this country, and descendants of people of African descent, are not able to kind of exercise any certain sort of quote unquote self-determination within the imperial core, specifically in the sense that BAP kind of speaks about how people of African descent in this country are kind of within this domestic colony, and that in many ways we are also colonized to the extent that we don't have access to the same resources. We're repressed 10 times more. And so it's interesting about something like Cop City is, for example, there's been this struggle in Atlanta, Georgia, but to a lesser, well, not to a lesser extent, but something that happened recently, semi-recently, was the announcement of Cop City, or creation of Cop City in New York, where I'm based. And, they talked about putting, I think, at least like $200 and something million on this police training facility in Queens, in a particular area of Queens that is predominantly Black, and kind of speaks to the looming nature and inherent sort of exploitation and race-based violence that the US is historically known for. So the practices of imperialism and bringing US military to the continent in order to repress and exploit and get in the terms of taking resources and police countries as well as people in those countries are largely the same, in the same context as the way that they maneuver and act towards Black communities in the US.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate you kind of describing the Cop City example in Queens, and just for folks, knowledge around the 1033 program. That is also an effort to militarize police administered by the Department of Defense, in which excess military equipment is transferred to U.S. police forces, whether federal, state, and local. And so, yeah, I think something like $6 billion worth of military equipment has been transferred so far. And so, yeah, all of this is, part of that broader structure that you mentioned. But yeah, just to keep things moving. Africom is often justified by U.S. officials as necessary for counterterrorism and stability in the region on the African continent. And so, how would you respond to those types of justifications? And what do you think are the real impacts of Africom on the African continent?
Yep. So, thankfully, there has been quite a good amount of research that has gone into understanding the linkages between the presence of Africom and of US military and violence on the continent and conflict. Oftentimes in mainstream media, we see kind of headlines that are like how, people kind of confused, like how could there be, another war breaks out in this part of Africa, and sort of linking it always to this kind of corrupt nature of the African or African government, and that good governance can't is really difficult to achieve on the continent. And so that's kind of usually the framing or the context in which people are talking about any sort of conflict and or terrorism. But it's interesting because actually, there has been research that shows ever since Africom has come to the continent, has laid its put its boots on the ground and established bases all over the continent, that there has actually been an increase in violence, there's been an increase in so-called terrorism, and that can be seen particularly in the example of the Sahel, which is extremely, popular right now. People are talking about the anti-imperial struggle in the Sahel. But it's interesting if we go back and we understand what happened with the NATO invasion of Libya in 2011. And it was after that kind of vacuum that was created, power vacuum that was created as a result of Gaddafi's assassination, that we saw just havoc all across the Sahel, across the continent largely, but particularly across the Sahel, because that area was so important in terms of trading and moving arms, weapons. And so as a result of that, we saw certain areas of the Sahel become, these danger zones, and that's when we see kind of the usage of terrorist groups in order to attempt to corral or essentially facilitate these arms deals and maintain the conflict and violence brought on from US foreign policy and from US intervention in coups. So that's kind of the linkage that we don't often get to see in mainstream media, that is actually the presence of the US. It's the presence of the US military and of soft power tactics that allow for violence to continue to ensue, but also for Africans and for colonized people to not have their agency. They've gotten their agency stripped away in terms of being able to fight back and being able to resist. But we saw that, in the Sahel, for example, as recently, that there is a renewed kind of struggle that is happening in that case, and they've sort of taken back that sovereignty that has been stripped from them.
Definitely, that's helpful framing. And speaking as you just spoke to, right? Like we've seen recent actions by African countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in the Sahel, actions to resist U.S. military influence, and in the case of Niger specifically, to expel African forces. What do you think those types of developments signal for the future of anti-imperialist struggles in Africa?
They signal a great deal. I think this is an exciting time for everyone on the continent. I think you talk to any African, whether they're on the continent or abroad in the diaspora, and you say, oh, heard about what's happening in the AES, and you're often met with a lot of excitement and saying that, there's so much to look forward to. And I'm hoping that we can be involved in the struggle or push that forward in, say, Congo or Nigeria or Uganda and Kenya. So that's really exciting from that perspective. But also, I think, to link it back to what we talked about earlier with trying to understand the real connection between terrorism and increased terrorism in certain parts of the continent and Africom, is that this struggle that's happening in the Sahel is against Western capital. It's against these major financial institutions, against these major multinational corporations. So I think when we think about what does anti-imperialist struggle mean, it's a lot, actually. And it's so much more than just we're going to expel Africom in one particular base. It means that they're a part of this larger move to take their country or their people out from under the US's raid. And so I think the US or the West more largely. So it's interesting because earlier in the summer, we heard about Ukraine's support, funny enough, despite there being an entire war happening for their quote unquote self-determination. Despite that happening, they were able to find time to support a literal terrorist attack against the AES, particularly in Mali. And it's interesting because we saw that play out, and then the AES actually even, wrote to the United Nations and said, like, do you not see, like, they are attempting to kind of strengthen, we see the Ukraine as one example of strengthening these terrorist groups, yet we're hearing from mainstream media, oh, look, the Wagner group, oh, look, Russia's involved in Mali and AES, and they're pushing for anti-democratic governance and things like that. And so I think it's interesting because what the actions and the words aren't matching up, and who's actually playing a part in the destabilization efforts are also not entirely what the mainstream media is saying. So I think that's one interesting point. And so that's a consequence, though, of making that move, the move that the AES has made. So I think this is showing a very positive sign of development, of attempting to move us away from underdevelopment, in the sense that we see, as of recently, Burkina Faso and many other folks within the AES have looked to begin the process of nationalizing these important resources that exist, whether that's gold, the gold mines, uranium is very important. So that, seeing how that plays out in Niger would also kind of show the strength and bring back economic sovereignty to the folks in AES as well. So I think that's a component that's interesting. But I'm also seeing, and I'd be remiss to not say that there are connections between the success of AES and potential more uprisings across the continent. I mean, it only shows that we've seen since the formation of AES, since the coups last year, there have been an uptick of a bunch of so many other uprisings in Kenya, in Uganda, in Nigeria, they and many other countries. And I think that speaks to this kind of excitement and inspiration from other Africans on the other side of the continent that are attempting to take back state power. And I think that speaks to, one, the conditions and austerity measures put by the governments, these African neo-colonial governments, and them and people saying enough is enough. So I'd be curious to see what that looks like moving forward, especially as we see the need for an increased, political education campaign and ideological trainings, so that the masses can continue to support not only the AES, but also what AES represents for the continent as a whole, right? We are building this kind of Pan-Africanist ideal, something that is thought of as ideal, but now is actually being realized and can be realized if folks are continue to be committed to it.
Yeah, that very well said. It's like you said, a very exciting time, and hopefully it can be built on the actions taken by the states that are part of the AES. Um, and yeah, no, that example you mentioned as far as Ukraine and their meddling or their support for, uh, the insurgent groups, the quote unquote terrorists in Mali. I think Mali also accused France, right, a couple of years back of, doing similar things in terms of supporting terrorists, and did that in front of the UN General Assembly as well. And so I think that speaks to the role of, these Western forces in the Sahel and beyond, right? But yeah, I appreciated that answer. My next question, though. So the U.S. military's presence in Africa is not only through Africom, but also in the form of partnerships with local governments and military. How did these partnerships complicate the efforts to dismantle Africom? And what strategies can, activists, organizers, or concerned people use to address that issue?
Yeah, I think the best kind of answer, and I'll expand on this, is by developing a very solid class analysis. It is very easy for us to get caught up in kind of the black faces in high places, representation politics, thinking that the rhetoric of coming out of the mouth of a particular African leader means that they will actually materially follow through with that kind of plan. I mean, we saw, I'll give you a great example, President Ruto from Kenya kind of had a lot of interesting, seemingly anti-imperialist rhetoric, a year or two ago, and look at what happens. I mean, with his attempted intervention in Haiti, but then we also see how he's treating his own citizens and the results of the finance bill and the type of repression that has happened as a result of folks fighting back and protesting against this. So, I mean, that is not an example of anti-imperialist struggle, but also It specifically means that we have to understand the role of capitalism and the capitalist system, and making sure that we're delinking anti-imperialist struggle with just a renewed neoliberal attempt with kind of this like mask of anti-imperialist rhetoric. So actually, the military presence is one thing, but it is definitely connected to understanding how international financial institutions are continuing to subvert any sort of type of economic sovereignty that states are attempting to uphold, but also how comprador leaders are attempting to subvert resistance, local domestic resistance, and spewing this anti-imperialist rhetoric, but coming out on the other side and shaking hands with folks in the US, folks at the UN, and making these backroom deals. So one thing that really stood out when I thought about how these partnerships can complicate activists' efforts to get the US out of Africa. An example of this can be seen in how we understand the role that international finance capital plays in infrastructure and developing the continent. Oftentimes, for example, in what's happening in Angola and Congo and kind of more broadly, like Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Zambia, is that they are attempting, or they're currently building through money from the US, money from the EU, this thing called the Libido Corridor. This is important to understand because they are currently trying to counter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and their attempt to build a railroad from Eastern to Central Africa in order to continue to transport these very important, for example, critical minerals that could be like copper, tin, tantalum, cobalt, things like that. I'm saying this because they need the security apparatus of these states to quote unquote secure the development of this infrastructure. So something like the Libido Corridor could be potentially useful for the average Angolan in their attempt to just use those areas for transportation. To they're involved in some sort of small business. They are a miner themselves, or they're a part of that process for manufacturing. Technically, they're a part of that development. However, we're seeing that as a result, as they get more linked to the international finance capital from the US, from the West, they have very little opportunity to delink themselves. And that's when they find, the use of Africom, these military bases, to protect property, to protect this capital that's being moved around. And who is going to kind of be at the butt end of this, and who is going to be affected by this negatively? Those are going to be the workers. Those are going to be the African masses. And so I bring up this example of the Libido Corridor, but also you can really look at this in understanding mines, and how mines across the Sahel, West Africa, whether that's in Ghana, as well as in Congo, and these particular sites are heavily, heavily militarized, but they're also the sites of heavy resistance. So I think this is super complicated because activists have to be a part of a two-pronged effort. It's one, to get the military presence out of there, but also to go against and resist multinational corporations and states in the West that attempt to use multinational corporations as a way to give them these deals to quote unquote develop their country. Like, we will take almost all of your natural resources at a very low price and maybe build you a road as a result of that. I mean, that's kind of a terrible deal, but that's kind of one example that I thought about this in terms of a strategy. And I'm sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but in terms of strategy, I think, again, for me, it's having clarity on our class analysis and making sure that we understand the role of the comprador class, this African managerial class, and we don't get kind of blindsided by their rhetoric, and we ensure that we empower the African masses and the African workers. So as long as the African workers are class conscious, I think we're in the right direction.
No, that's really well said. I appreciate the emphasis on class analysis, and I didn't think it was long-winded. I really feel like I learned a lot about that corridor and the Angolan workers, which I hadn't really thought about too much. So appreciated that response. And yeah, I agree. I think that that's really helpful framing. But yeah, just to keep moving, um, how does the month of action against AFRICOM connect with broader anti-imperialist movements? And why is it important to view the fight against AFRICOM within the larger context of global resistance to militarization or Western domination?
Absolutely. I think this is a wonderful question because this speaks to a larger point that we are in a very critical moment right now with active resistance to genocide happening in the Middle East, which is also very much connected to AFRICOM or in the US militarism on the continent, in that it is the same force that's funding, aiding and abetting genocide happening towards Israel, who also is present on the continent, that's also funding these quote unquote paramilitary death squads, the quote unquote terrorist groups. I mean, we're seeing the same things happen in the sense that we know that occupation is happening in Palestine, and genocide is happening in Palestine. But occupation is also happening in Africa. We have not seen, since AFRICOM has been here, a free Africa, in the sense that it has been occupied, been under U.S. occupation since, we can talk about since colonialism, but particularly under the thumb of U.S. imperialism since 2008. And it's important that we say that it was since 2008 because that was also the time that we had our first Black president, and it was the first Black president that made sure that he was a part of this occupying force on the continent. And so I think that kind of speaks to the issue of representation politics as well. But the month of action against AFRICOM is really important because if we can understand the role that the US military has in fighting these wars, but also in just physically being present in these countries, whether that's training the militaries of the armies of these other countries, in helping to give arms, participate in arms deals, and also control a very important minerals, for example, uranium, in order to make sure that other countries don't have access to nuclear arms. Yet there was a recent, call for the U.S. government to spend the next 10 years revitalizing their nuclear arms. I think this speaks to the importance of the continent as a whole in being able to prevent another world war. We talk about world war in the context of the Middle East. We talk about world war in the context of Europe. But we have not yet, I don't think, have talked about the context of world war happening in the center of it being on the continent of Africa. So the month of action against AFRICOM is important because we are fighting against U.S. military presence, but we're fighting against imperialism, and we're talking about the need to end all wars, all types of wars, and work with other resistance groups, whether they're in Venezuela, whether they're in Nicaragua, whether they're in Cuba, in Latin America, in Haiti, or they're in the Middle East, or they're in Asia. But the truth of the matter is there's uprisings happening all over the world, and AFRICOM is a very important piece of it because it connects the broader struggle happening on the continent as it relates to anti-imperialism and anti kind of any sort of like austerity measures, I think, but also it speaks to us wanting to end world war and, looking for a new world order. So I think that's part of it.
Absolutely. And those were all of the questions I had for you today. But is there anything else you want to discuss before we close?
No, I think that's it. I think these were great questions. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And we hope to have you back on soon to maybe discuss some of your work around, the green transition in East and Central Africa or other topics. But yeah, thanks again.
Thanks so much, Tunde.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.